Hi there everyone! Welcome to this week's video where we're going to discuss Hume, and in particular Hume's Enquiry concerning human understanding. Now Hume is a really interesting, very fascinating figure within the sort of trajectory of empiricist philosophers that we've discussed up to this point. Hume's reputation and the history of his reception is quite interesting. He was actually not all that popular as a philosopher during his own era. Before he wrote this text that we're reading here today, the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, he previously wrote a humongous book, this book called The Treatise on Human Nature, which was almost entirely ignored by all of his contemporaries. It wasn't until, around the early 20th century that Hume's legacy underwent a kind of revival. And now, I believe that there was a poll among the professional opinions of philosophers working today, and Hume's treatise on human nature actually won this poll. So it was people consider it as the best philosophy book ever written, right? The #1 philosophy book admired by professional philosophers working today. So that's all to say that during his own era, people were much more interested in Locke and also much more interested in Hume's historical work rather than his philosophical work. But of course, nowadays, Hume is almost entirely known for his works in philosophy. And this is because I think, obviously this is going to engender some amount of disagreement, but for most people would consider Hume the strictest empiricist of this entire tradition of British empiricism. In other words, Hume developed, I think, the most consistent and sophisticated philosophical framework in order to accommodate the basically empiricist orientation happening in philosophy. And that is why he is so well loved and so revered. And as you're going to see, he's kind of a funny writer, too. He really doesn't care very much about technical terms and vocabulary, and he's willing to be quite funny, right, and lighthearted about his philosophy, which is actually an important aspect of his philosophical method. So we can summarize some big picture stuff about Hume's view via this quotation given in the early parts of the Enquiry, where Hume advises us to be a philosopher, but amidst your philosophy, still be a man. In other words, what I take Hume's point, generally speaking, here to be is that the point of philosophy is to help us develop a particularly human kind of wisdom, right? We're human beings looking to understand the nature of our own situation, and that we actually get off track from doing that, right? Providing a genuine account of human wisdom when we engage in the kind of lofty, speculative, metaphysical endeavors of the rationalists who we've discussed up to this point, right? So for Hume, first philosophy shouldn't be the kind of metaphysical meditations that we find in Descartes' work. Philosophy should be less about metaphysics, establishing ultimate foundations, all of that kind of stuff, and more about the study of anthropology or human nature. Right? The way that Hume writes and works, I think, would be pretty foreign to a modern day anthropologist, right? But he's interested in this question about human nature, right? What is it that human beings can know? What are the things that human beings can do? What are our capabilities, and how do we best utilize them? For this reason, Hume thinks that the way that philosophical text should be oriented is as an exploration of human faculties, right? And in this case, since we're talking about knowledge specifically, it's going to be the human faculties of knowledge, right? Okay, so now let's start to get into the particulars of his view. Hume holds that all ideas can be divided into matters of fact and relations of ideas, right? He otherwise says, for example, sensation and thought, right? Sensation being with the matter of fact, thought being on the side of relations between ideas, right? And this is meant to basically capture a similar distinction as Locke makes, for example, between sensation and reflection, right? So the primary objects or items of human knowledge come from sensation, right? We learn various matters of fact about the world, and then we organize those sensations and we come to relate ideas to one another, right? But here again, just as in the Lockean framework, the relations of ideas are dependent on matters of fact. Matters of fact are going to be the primary source for the generation of new knowledge. Now, these two kinds of mental representations, sensations and ideas, are distinguished from one another qualitatively, right? So sensations are impressions, but thoughts or ideas are merely recreations of these impressions. And so the impressions themselves are more vivid. So, for example, if you'd like, look, for example, at your light wherever you are being on, right? Because you're perceiving this light directly, it's not possible to entertain doubt about it, right? Even if I paid you $1 million to believe that there's no light on, as long as you're looking directly at the light, well, you can't voluntarily change your beliefs, right? Impressions have this aspect of themselves where they're pressing on you, right? They make you have certain kinds of mental representations or beliefs, right? But by contrast, thoughts, because they're merely recreations of these impressions in your mind, thoughts, you can, imagine rather than perceive your light, and in that case, you can imagine it either on or off, right? So the relations of ideas or thoughts are less distinct and less particular than impressions are. Okay, so we know in a kind of typical empiricist fashion that these sensations or impressions are primary, and the matters of fact that they convey to us are also primary, and the thoughts, memories, and relations of ideas that they leave in their wake are secondary. But now we should discuss orders of relation between impressions, right? How are impressions related to one another, right? If we want to be good empiricists, we should know about this kind of stuff, right? Here's Hume's basic idea. Hume's idea is that there are three ways that we order impressions with one another, right? So the first is resemblance. This is really easy. When two impressions resemble one another, right, they have a property in common, right? So you can think, for example, about two red things or your last two breakfasts, right? In these cases, we're able to order or relate our impressions according to a certain rule, namely a kind of property that they have, being breakfast or being red, right? Okay, that's really easy. Contiguity is also pretty easy, right? So contiguity is just when two things are proximate or next to each other in time or space, right? So my example is two neighboring apartments, right? These apartments don't necessarily need to resemble each other. They can be totally different from one another on the inside. They can be different sizes and so on, right? But they are contiguous with one another, right? We can order our impressions to ask what's next to what else, and therefore come to relate these neighboring apartments, right? Finally, the last order of impressions, and the one that is going to be the most puzzling for us, is cause and effect, right? This is where one thing makes another thing happen, right? So, for example, you see one billiard ball collide into and impart motion into another billiard ball, right? Okay, notice that there's something a little bit different about this third order of relation of impressions than the other one, right? Namely, that it has this feature that philosophers call objective purport, right? So when I'm saying that two things resemble each other, I'm really just making a subjective claim, right? That they look like each other to me, right? Contiguity, similarly, is perspectival, right? The two things are next to each other from a certain perspective. By contrast, cause and effect, you're making an objective claim. You're making a claim about the things that you say are ordered by this cause and effect relationship. So you're saying something about not just your idea of the billiard ball, but the billiard ball itself imparting motion into the second billiard ball that it collides into, right? And so now we can legitimately ask of this one, rather than the other two, what is the ground of the objective purport of cause and effect, right? And this is where we get a philosophical problem known as Hume's fork. The basic question is, where do we get our idea of cause and effect, and in particular our claim to have knowledge about the relationship between cause and effect, right? We located that as the difference between cause and effect and these other orders of our impressions, right? But what grounds or justifies that claim, right? That objective purport? Well, Hume's problem involves a fork, right? Like a fork in the road where you have to choose between two options, neither of which is fully satisfying. Either we have to say that we to have a direct impression of causality, a causal force, in which case it's a matter of fact, or we have to say that causal force is merely a relation of ideas. So in other words, when I think of one billiard ball, I have to think of the other billiard ball, right? And it's going to turn out that neither of these options is really satisfying. Why not? Well, in the first case, Hume wants us to observe that we don't witness anything like the causal force that moves the first billiard ball to strike the second, right? In other words, I only experience the effect of this causal force, right? You can break down my perception of the interaction between the billiard balls as being a bunch of still images, right? And I could ask you where in any of the still images is the causal force, right? And you might locate the moment where one billiard ball hits the other, or something like that. But again, that's an effect of the causal force and not the causal force itself, right? I never directly experience anything like causal force, right? All I have is one impression, the billiard ball 1 getting on the trajectory to strike billiard ball 2, billiard ball 1 being in motion, and then billiard ball 2 also being in motion thereafter, right? And so I see various effects of what I think is a causal force, but I never have a direct impression of causal forces. Now, it's really actually worse to say that cause and effect is a relation of ideas. Why? Well, because when we're talking about causality, we're not talking about my idea. I'm not saying that my idea of one billiard ball causes another feature of my idea of another billiard ball. No, I'm saying the actual billiard balls in reality have a causal relationship with one another. And that claim is inconsistent with the basic structure of what Hume calls thoughts or relations of ideas. Now, notice also Hume makes another point here, which is that we actually never come to know causal relationships like how the rationalists sort of envisioned it with geometry. In other words, I never know from the essence of one billiard ball that one of its features or something like that is that it's going to impart motion into a second billiard ball. I can never deduce the existence of smoke from fire. To the contrary, I learn about the nature of these causal relations simply through certain kinds of impressions, in particular constant conjunctions, right? I learn that fire and smoke have a causal relationship because I constantly perceive a relationship between fire and smoke. So for this part of the reading, Hume leaves us with a huge problem, which is that it seems that we don't have any rational grounding or basis for the nature of causal knowledge. And that seems bad because if you'll recall from Spinoza and perhaps other figures, causal knowledge is said to be all of science. Right? In other words, for a science to be a science, it's supplying us some kind of causal knowledge. And so there's a worry that Hume has put the entirety of human knowledge in science that we've developed up to this point in jeopardy. Join me next time and we will discuss Hume's solution to the problem that he discusses with causality. Do you agree with the basic structure of Hume's fork? Does causality have to be grounded by a matter of fact or a relation of ideas? Why or why not? I look forward to hearing what you think, and I will see you in the next video.